Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for this kind introduction. I also would like to thank the chairman and the organizer for having me today, especially for assigning the last talk to me, believing that I can get everybody engaged and focused, no pressure. I was telling Dr. Mana before I had the chance to stand here on the podium to talk that what actually got me into basic research is a conversation I had with Dr. Ahmed Al-Saghir when he actually gave me an advice, and he said, Mohammed, when you go into a field that you can mix two specialties together, always try and choose something that you like and something that you don't like. And I liked basic science. So for hematologists, when they actually look at this picture, it is a very tragic incident that happened in 1945. But for us as hematologists, this is actually the seed that grew the tree for stem cell transplantation science and research. This atomic bombing that happened at these two cities opened the minds and the brains of all scientists on how they can manage post-radiation complication. So I would like to walk you through two important, I would say, domains before I talk about translational research as the bridge between these two domains. We can start by talking about the definition for each of those domains. So I'll start first talking about basic science. The definition is actually available everywhere. I use the National Institutes of Health as a guidance, for example. So generally speaking, before I think the 1950s, basic science research was supposed to be linked to application of knowledge, which actually caused slow in acquisition of knowledge. And since that moment, there was actually a universal decision to separate basic science from knowledge application. So that actually liberated the scientists to just continue at a very fast pace to acquire knowledge, not worrying about how they can apply it in the clinic. Just keep working. We will give you all the support and all the funds you need. Just keep acquiring the knowledge, and somebody else will try and make sense of them. This actually resulted in basic science to actually be very well established and pervasive for so many universities in so many fields. In fact, NIH per se, they actually allocate up to 60 to 70% for basic science research, only to collect the knowledge, which funds a lot of PhD and master students. So how did the basic scientists actually help the stem cell field following the tragedy I just showed you? Like almost 4 years later, this group led by Jacobson actually found that if you shield the spleen and as much area of the bone marrow of irradiated mice, you can actually allow those mice to survive lethal radiation. And then few years later, another group found out that you actually, if you collect those cells from the spleen or the bone marrow and inject them after radiation, you can actually allow these mice to survive. You can actually see the sequence of how the knowledge now is being built up in this field. And lastly, but not the least, is actually they found out, which was very interesting paper, that which start forming the basis of chimera or chimerism. The actual cytogenetics of the bone marrow from the donor cells will be reflective when you collect bone marrows from mice transplanted with these bone marrow cells. And then walking you through the second domain to understand what translational research is. Clinical research, again, you can go anywhere to read. You can go with whatever definition you want. What I want to tell you, basically, clinical research has to be, in any form or way, patient-oriented. Whether there is a direct encounter with the patient or you're handling patient-related samples. Including also epidemiological studies, behavioral studies, and whatever is needed to study the outcome of clinical research. As much as the NIH, for example, were trying to encourage people to do basic science research, they've done the same thing with clinical research. Maybe because clinical research is not as expensive in those days, but until now, they still allocate only 30 to 40% of their funds for clinical research. Maybe NIH is more basic science oriented, but support is happening in both fields. Okay, so what have clinicians done following this tragedy? How did they actually understand the basic science research? And especially when the Olympic torch was relayed by this study that I put first in 1956 by Bernet et al., they actually reported that you can actually save mice from leukemia if you infuse them with normal mouse marrow. So we all know Ed Thomas. He's one of the godfather of stem cell transplant. So initially in 1957, he and his group attempted to do a stem cell transplant, which actually failed. They didn't actually know why. They just tried to translate whatever happened in mice. And after Dr. Ayman's talk and the other talk, I can tell you that these studies, if they were happening in our days, they would not have happened because of the ethics limitation. A few years later, Thomas et al., they actually were able to do the first successful stem cell transplant, but only because the donor was the twin sibling. Because later on, until late in 1960s, they have done 200 transplants. All of them have failed. So how would translation research help in this dogma? Especially after you've heard that it resulted at the end in so many patients dying in need for stem cell transplant that they could not be saved. Let's start again by trying and understanding what is translational research. Again, whatever definition you're going to go with, what I'm trying to tell you is basically this is where the gap is happening. A translation researcher is supposed to be the ones who actually apply the knowledge taken from either the bench to the bed. So whatever the basic scientists have found out, translation researchers will help applying this or co-help applying this into the clinic. The other option is, or the other field or the other area they have to be involved in is when you have a lot of clinical studies published and done, how can you actually translate this into guidelines and practice changing? But you can actually, so I'm just trying in this slide to summarize the two things I want to tell you, because that definition until recently for so many translation researchers is not covering an important area. So two things again, transferring knowledge from bench to bed and also translating knowledge for practice changing in the communities. And I'll tell you why this resulted in a problem, because if you remember the dates I'm trying to give you, so we said until late 1960s, people hit the wall. They didn't know why transplant was not working. And you can see it actually took a decade for this discovery to happen, because they were acquiring knowledge without trying to read what's happening in the field. So we all know Jean Dosset. Before his discovery, there were some work about trying and find out what are those antigens that actually develop on the white cell following multiple transfusions or pregnancy. So later on, he comes and his group and other groups to start describing what we call them now HLA, or human leukocyte antigen. Very beautiful studies were happening between 1968 and 1971. They actually did describe this like in animals for the first time, in dogs, and they actually were able to find if you do not match for dog leukocyte antigens, dogs will actually die from graft failure. If you do so with a little bit of immunosuppression, they actually survive longer. So if that knowledge was actually happening at the same time, maybe those transplants that happened later on that year would have been successful. So at the end, what is not happening with translation research now? It's not only two things. There are four things that you need to consider why translation research is important. I would call them even cornerstones. First and foremost, the translation researchers, they actually have to continue to develop clinically relevant questions, because as we said, basic science is only a knowledge that are waiting to be applied. You need to find that broader prospective question, that strategic question with strategic design, that you can actually create a clinical study out of this. And the most important role for translation researcher, they emphasize the benefit of multi-collaboration. And this is not only clinicians or clinician and scientists, it's everybody, including policymakers, epidemiologists. The larger the group is, the more productive the outcome will be, all toward helping in translation. And another important thing, which you guys would agree, this was the problem in the 1950s, 1960s area, is translation was only happening unidirectional. So it was happening from the bench to the bed, and then that's it. So the new trend now is you actually take it back again. So it has to be bidirectional. Why did we fail? Okay, something we don't do a lot in Islamic countries. For example, autopsies. Autopsies actually, they have led into so many discoveries in the Western countries. So you bring in a new therapy, like what Dr. Rahman was saying about, CAR-T, that kid unfortunately died. You do the autopsy right away and you get your answer back to the lab. So you would know biologically why the death happened. As he was saying, in their first attempt, it was just an unfortunate herpes activation, disease progression. You can get this answer we don't actually get here because we wouldn't know. خلاص رحمة الله عليه توفى. We don't know. But this is very important information to take it back again and see why this has happened. Because this actually will help tie together the clinical studies with the lab. And then we want to emphasize on one thing is translational researchers, they have to work in a group where they acknowledge that there is no one superstar. No matter what you do, no matter where you work, you don't know everything. You cannot keep up with everything. So having a diverse group or a homogeneous group, even if they are all hematologists or oncologists or respirologists, someone knows better about one area or the other. This actually helps for that collaboration to be much more fruitful and meaningful. And the most important point I want to emphasize after also hearing your talk is it's very important how you actually write translation research, because you will be facing a lot of challenges, whether for grants application. So writing is an important tool in communication among each other and with the organizers or with the authorities or societies. So this is just a summary to show that it has to be bidirectional. It never stops. It doesn't go in one direction only. You have to keep it rolling between the bedside, between the bench and the bedside. So aside from what I told you, I wanted these take-home messages to junior learners also. You have to decide whether you want to go with basic science or clinical research or translational, that it's the right path for you. Like I remember before I was admitted to the biochemistry school, I had my first meeting with the supervisor, and it was a very relaxing meeting because he asked me one question. He said, Mohammed, if you actually came to my lab to have a degree plated on the wall, you came to the wrong lab. So I can tell you how stressful that question was, and how I don't know how did I actually impress him or answer him correctly for him to accept me into his lab. But you really need to know, is this the right path or not? Do you really want to do the research for the sake of publication only, or to do something good to your patients or to the community? And finding the right mentor, right supervisor is very important. It becomes hard sometimes to talk to former students, but that will help you whether you want to do basic science or clinical research. And life-work balance, the most important thing is our selves and family. The more you actually dig deeper into research, the more your life could be compromised. So you need to find a way of how you can balance between your work, your research, and your life. And then have a very open career plan. So a very important thing that is coming and happening nowadays that will help everybody considering is it doesn't have to be always academia. You can always go into a pharmaceutical company. I think one of the reasons why pharmaceutical companies are not invested in like Arabic or Saudi researchers, because we never show that we are interested in what they do. And the type of research they do and the type of translation they do is different. And I think we are more than capable of helping in both types of research. I tried to fast pace my presentation so we finish on time. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer.